When Queen Jane Seymour gave birth to Prince Edward, the future Edward VI, in October 1537, bells rang out across England, and in London, Te Deums were sung. Fires were lit in the streets, hogsheads of wine enjoyed by the people, and guns shot at the Tower of London. Henry VIII finally had his longed-for son. England had a prince. But within days, that triumph turned to tragedy. On the 24th of October 1537, 12 days after giving birth, Queen Jane Seymour died. Her death has been explained in many ways, from romanticised tales of a Caesarean section to the more modern claim by historian and author Alison Weir that Jane actually died not from childbirth complications, but from a mixture of food poisoning, dehydration, anemia and embolism. I'm author and historian Claire Ridgway, and today I want to take a closer look at that theory and explain why the traditional explanation, puerperal sepsis or childbed fever caused by infection after childbirth, still makes far more medical and historical sense. Now, I'm not a doctor, but then neither is Alison Weir. We're just historians making judgments based on the contemporary sources. So let's look at what happened. Jane went into labour on the afternoon of the 9th of October at Hampton Court Palace, where she'd taken to her chamber to prepare for the birth. It was a long and difficult labour, about 30 hours, ending around 2 o'clock on the morning of the 12th, when she finally delivered the future Edward VI. There had been a solemn procession and prayers in London on the 11th of October for the Queen. There was clearly anxiety regarding her labour. The Register of the Most Noble Order of the Garter recorded Queen Jane was freed from her very hard labour, which she had bore with exceeding pain for about 2 whole days. So this wasn't a simple or easy birth. It was drawn out and exhausting. Now, we can dismiss one early rumour straight away. Catholic writer Nicholas Sander claimed in the 1580s that Jane's child was cut from her womb while she was still alive, supposedly because Henry ordered doctors to save the baby at any cost. But there's absolutely no evidence for that. Jane was up and signing letters announcing the birth later that same day, and she was up and moving around on the 15th, the day of the christening. If she'd undergone that kind of surgery, she would never have survived even a few hours. So we can safely set aside the myth of the Caesarean section. Alison Weir, in a 4-part guest article for Tudor Times to accompany her novel Jane Seymour, The Haunted Queen, argues that Jane didn't die from puerperal fever or childbed fever at all. She points out that the surviving sources don't explicitly mention fever, and she interprets the records as describing 2 separate illnesses. First, on the 16th of October, 4 days after giving birth, Jane had what the report calls a natural lax. Weir reads this as diarrhoea, probably from food poisoning from something eaten after the christening feast. Jane then seemed to recover, but on the 19th of October became seriously ill again. By the 23rd, she was declining rapidly and she died on the 24th. Weir suggests the initial food poisoning left her dehydrated and anemic. Prolonged bed rest might then have caused a blood clot leading to an embolism, a blockage that reached her lungs or heart and eventually caused cardiac failure. It's an interesting modern medical reconstruction, but for me it doesn't quite fit the historical evidence or what we know about 16th century childbirth. Weir's main argument rests on this. Because the sources don't mention fever, Jane couldn't have died from childbed fever. But that's risky reasoning. 16th century writers didn't use medical terms the way we do. Fever might not appear in the text even when infection was clearly present. Reports are vague. They talk about Jane being very sick, taken with cold, and in great danger. And Cromwell mentions her calling for food, which he saw as unsuitable, in her fantasy in sickness, which sounds like delirium to me. Modern clinicians also point out that sepsis doesn't always begin with high fever. Contemporary guidance on maternal sepsis by the NHS, the National Health Service of the UK, and the NCT, the UK's National Childbirth Trust, list diarrhoea, vomiting, chills, confusion, and a feeling of cold or clamminess among the possible symptoms. So the very natural lax that Weir reads as food poisoning could easily have been an early sign of infection, or actually a natural bowel movement. And the taken with cold could be the feeling of cold or clamminess. We know from the records that Jane's labour lasted around 30 hours, and that means her uterus was under extreme strain. In modern obstetrics, such a prolonged labour is a textbook risk factor for retained placenta or placental fragments because the womb becomes exhausted and fails to contract properly after delivery and to expel all of the placenta. When even a small piece of placenta remains inside, it becomes an ideal breeding ground for bacteria, leading to infection, fever, and, if untreated, sepsis and death. It was one of the main causes of postpartum mortality, along with bacteria from unclean hands and instruments before modern-day medicine. In my opinion, the timeline fits sepsis. So let's explore it a bit more. Around the 9th of October, Jane goes into labour. 12th of October, she gives birth. 15th of October, she appears well enough when she was moved to an antechamber to watch her son be processed to the chapel for his christening and to receive her son after the christening when she and the king gave him their blessing. 16th of October, Jane is taken ill. 17th of October, her illness appears to reach crisis point, then she temporarily recovers before going downhill once more. 19th of October, her condition worsens. 23rd of October, she has what her physicians call a natural lax, which could be a normal bowel movement or diarrhoea. 24th of October, she receives the sacrament of extreme unction and dies. That's 12 days postpartum, which fits the time frame in which infection from retained placental tissue typically kills, even today if untreated. Sepsis often includes deceptive improvements, a day or two of seeming recovery before the infection overwhelms the body. That temporary lightening mentioned in the sources fits that pattern perfectly. But what about food poisoning? Could she have eaten something that made her ill? Well, possibly. Banquets after births were lavish and food hygiene wasn't what it is today. But food poisoning starts within a few hours of eating the contaminated food, and actually most cases only last 24 to 48 hours and aren't particularly serious. If she'd recovered on the 17th, the later decline on the 19th suggests the cause lay deeper, inside the body and not on the plate. After Jane's death, one account blamed the fault of them that were about her, who suffered her to take great cold and eat things her fantasy desired. And Weir takes that literally, that she physically caught a chill. But taking cold was a broad Tudor phrase, and it could just as easily describe the coldness of the extremities seen in shock or circulatory collapse. Again, consistent with septic shock, when blood pressure plummets and the skin turns clammy. In other words, the witnesses might actually have been describing sepsis without understanding what they were seeing. Weir notes that chroniclers didn't describe discharges, odours, or uterine pain, but it's worth remembering how little personal medical detail would ever be recorded about a queen's body. So silence on the more unpleasant realities of postpartum infection isn't proof that they weren't there. There's another factor that we need to consider. Jane was treated by a royal physician, not an experienced midwife. Well, that sounds impressive, the best medical care in England. But in Tudor times, that wasn't necessarily an advantage. Most male physicians had little hands-on experience of childbirth. They were university trained in Galenic theory, not practical obstetrics. Midwives, on the other hand, delivered babies every week, if not every day. They knew the signs of retained placenta, hemorrhage or infection, and they often had practical remedies to help expel tissue or to control bleeding. A midwife might have recognised that Jane hadn't expelled all the placenta or that she was showing early signs of infection. A royal doctor, however, may have been reluctant to examine her intimately or intervene in ways that he considered beneath a physician's station or inappropriate for a queen. So ironically, Jane's royal status and access to elite medicine may have worked against her. She had the prestige of a physician, but not the skilled, instinctive care of a woman who dealt with childbirth regularly. Sepsis and childbed fever fit the broader pattern. In Tudor England, childbed fever was tragically common. Before hand washing and antibiotics, bacteria from attendants' hands or unclean instruments entered the birth canal easily. Most fatal cases occurred between day 5 and day 15 after the birth, precisely Jane's window. Her symptoms, fatigue, possible bowel disturbance, short-lived recovery, and then collapse with coldness and confusion, mirror countless documented cases of postpartum sepsis. Weir's medical consultants proposed embolism, a blood clot travelling to the heart or lungs, as the final cause, but nothing in the sources hints at shortness of breath, sudden collapse, or acute chest pain typical of a pulmonary embolism. Instead, Jane declined gradually over several days. An embolism might have contributed late in the process. Sepsis itself can trigger clotting problems, but it's unlikely to have been the original cause. The following scenario is far more likely in my view. After 30 hours of labour, the placenta didn't fully detach. Residual tissue remained in the uterus, leading to local infection. Within 4 days, the infection spread, causing diarrhoea, weakness, and then systemic sepsis. By the 19th, the infection had entered her bloodstream. She died in septic shock on the 24th of October, 1537. That explanation requires no speculative embolisms, no food poisoning, and no mystery. Only the sad reality of Tudor childbirth. Weir is of course right to question old assumptions. Her rejection of the Caesarean story is sound, and her desire to look medically at the records is commendable. But in my view, she's trying too hard to find a rare modern diagnosis where a common historical one fits perfectly. In a world without sterilisation, antibiotics, or understanding of bacteria, sepsis was the quiet killer of mothers, and it fits every known detail of Jane Seymour's final 12 days. She wasn't killed by a surgeon's knife, spoilt food, or an embolism, but by the same tragedy that claimed so many Tudor women. She didn't die because she was unlucky, she died because she lived in a world that didn't yet understand infection, and where even queens couldn't rely on truly experienced care. If you found this medical mystery of Tudor history interesting, please do give this video a like and share your thoughts below. Do you agree that sepsis is the most probable cause? I'd love to know what you think. And do subscribe for more daily Tudor stories and myth-busting deep dives. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.